All right, this video is about how do you write the equation of a sine or a cosine graph. I took a moment over here to remind you the general form for a sine or a cosine graph is as follows. Within this, we do need to find the a, b, c, and d values from our graph. The d and a values you can find directly from looking at a picture of a sine or cosine curve. And the b value you get by using this formula of 2 pi over b is equivalent to the period, cross-multiplying to solve for your b value. The c, however, is a little bit trickier. It's going to depend on what point on the curve you're looking at. So are you looking at a maximum point, which would be a positive cosine curve, or a minimum point, which would be a negative cosine curve, a point on the midline on the way up, a positive sine curve, or a point on the midline on the way down. Those would be examples of negative sine curves. So that will change from question to question. So let's just take a look at a couple of examples. If I want to take a second to look at a graph here. In this graph, we know that the d value of the graph comes from our midline. So I see my max is up here at 1, my min is at 0, so my midline must be right along here at y equals 0.5. So if my mid is y equals 0.5, next I need to find the amplitude. Again, it's the distance between the max and the mid, or from the mid to the min. As a result, both of these are the same, and I actually have here that my amplitude is actually the same thing as my midline. In this case, it's a half, or 0.5. So we currently know that the d value for our equation is 0.5 and the a value for the equation is 0.5. Next thing that we want to take a look at is what is the period of this graph. If I start at the y-axis where x is 0 and track along until the next corresponding point, I get what my period is. So my markings are down here. So I get the period here is actually pi. So I can say that my period is pi units long. And I'm going to use that to solve for my b value. I know that 2 pi over b is the equation for the period. In this case, it equals pi. I'm going to make that into a fraction by putting it over 1, cross-multiply to solve for your b value. b is being multiplied by something. To undo multiplication, we divide. So I get that 2 is the value of b for this equation. So I know that the b value is 2. So I have a, b, and d. Those will be the same for every single equation that we write for this curve. After that, it's just a matter of what starting point we're looking at. The first equation that I'm going to choose to write is going to be the one for the point that falls on the y-axis. So for this guy right here. For this guy right here, I can say that my equation is y equals, this is a cosine curve at this point because it starts at the minimum, so it would be a negative cosine curve. So I'm going to say y equals negative. The a value is 0.5. It's a cosine curve, so it starts at a min. The b value we said is 2. And I need another set of parentheses, and here is where my translation left or right would come into play. If this point did not fall right here on the y-axis, then it would be translated, but this guy is on the y-axis, so it is not translated. So my c value is actually 0 in this question, or for this particular equation. And then at the end is the plus d, that's my midline, so that's 0.5. Now, that's great, but there are other equations for the same exact curve. So for instance, if I take a look at this point right here, I could write an equation for that. That's on the midline, so it would be a sine curve, and it's on the midline on the way up. So this would be a positive sine curve. So for that point, I could say the equation is y equals positive 0.5 sine, again, same b value because the period has not changed, x, and this is where I look for my left or right. Do I have any translation? The sine curve should be right there if it has not been translated, but this guy has been shifted to the right pi over 4. So I look where it should be and versus where it is. And that gives me my direction. This guy's going right pi over 4. So my equation, a right would be a minus sign, and it's going right pi over 4. And then last, the midline. That is not changed. I can keep going with this. I'm going to write one more here. Let's see, let's go with a red point, kind of pinky red. So if I'm looking up here at this point, this is a maximum, so that would be a cosine curve, a positive cosine curve. So if that was the point, it would be y equals, again, positive 0.5, cosine, because it starts at the maximum. The period is the same, so the b is the same, x, and now again I need to think about my translation left or right. It should be right there if it has not been translated, but this guy has been moved to the right a quantity of pi over 2. So I need to be able to write pi over 2 into my equation. Right would be minus pi over 2, and then again the midline at the end. So noticing that for all of these graphs, I have a common A, B, and D value, and the things that are changing for me are if it's positive or negative, and what the value of C is dependent on what point I'm focusing on my curve. I can write an infinite many more of these points, or of these equations, based on which point I'm looking at. So that's if I have a nice graph. The other way that we can see this is if I just give you a couple of points, and within those points I asked you to come up with an equation. So in these cases I want to create a picture. So in this particular example, we are given that I have a maximum at 2,5, and then my next corresponding minimum at 8,1. So 2,5 to 8,1. I'm just going to give some sense of scale. I'm not going to try too hard on this, but so I'm going to say this is 2 and this is 5. So I have a point here. And then the next guy is the next minimum. So I'm going to erase that. The next minimum is at 8,1. So I know from a maximum to a minimum, I have created half of my curve, right? This graph is going something like this. From here, it's going to turn and come back up again. The question is, what are the coordinates of this other point that was not given to me? So I need to use the patterns of our curves in order to come up with that. I know that it has the same y value as this point here, so its y value must be 5, so it's something comma 5. And then after that, I need to figure out what its x value is. We know from the max to the first min, there were 6 units. So to get from my min to my next max, it'll be evenly spaced. So it'll be another 6 units. So 8 plus 6 is 14. So 14 is the x value of that point. Now that I have this, it's basically the same question as the previous example. I need to figure out where my midline is. So my middle would be kind of right in here someplace. So I think that's at 3. So my D value is 3. My amplitude is from the middle to the top, so my amplitude is my A value, that is 2. The next thing that we said we had to talk about was what is the period. So if I'm looking at period, I'm looking at the distance between these 2 points. So it goes from 2 to 14, so 14 minus 2 is 12, and that's my period. Now, we did say earlier that if we know the period, then we can figure out the b value. We know that period equals 2 pi over b. And here we know the period is 12. So if I want to solve, put that over 1, cross multiply, I get that 12b equals 2 pi, and therefore b equals 2 pi over 12, which reduces to pi over 6. That makes me uncomfortable because there's a pi in it, but that actually is completely normal. It is completely okay for me to have a pi within my b value. So we're going to let that stay as it is. So we currently know the D is 3, A is 2, and then our B, we just said, is pi over 6. So from that, we can write our equation. The first point that they give us is this guy right here. It's a maximum, so I think the easiest equation to write for this would be a cosine equation. So if they just ask us to write the equation of the function, so that just is one equation, so I'm not going to worry about writing many more. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and say that this is y equals, so let me go to black on this, y equals the a value, which we said was 2. It's starting at a maximum, so it's positive. It's starting at max, so it's cosine. The b value we said was pi over 6 right there. So I'm going to put a pi over 6 into my b value. Parentheses. The next thing we need to talk about was our translation. Cosine should be on the y-axis at its maximum, but this guy's been moved to the right 2. So I've gone right 2, so I need to build right 2 into my equation. So x right is minus 2. And the last thing that we need is our d value. We said that that was 3. So our final equation for this particular curve is y equals 2 cosine pi over 6 parentheses x minus 2 plus 3.